Hi, Misha here, and this is the Beretta M9A4. Introduced a couple of years back, it's more or less the most modernized version of what has become a classic in America, despite itself and despite many kind of naysayers. And I mentioned in a recent video that we would be looking at the M11, comparing it to the M11A1. That's still happening, promise you. We're going to talk lots of SIGs. But the weather is getting very cold and snowy, so instead of getting stuck at the cabin, possibly without power, because it's supposed to get to the negatives, I'm here, so we're going to have some videos. We're just going to talk about not just the XM11 trials, but we'll do a couple of videos talking about the XM9 and the sometimes overlooked XM10 trials, which is why this gun still exists today, why Beretta is still producing a Wunder 9 that they first introduced in the 1970s for Italian police that became a standard here for decades, and even its replacement was controversial with the M17. But this version, the A4, was never introduced, and this one's just actually out of the store, just grabbed it to show you. Although when it came out, Jay did grab the original M9A3, this gun's immediate predecessor, and very similar. But with that, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. Like to help support us, go over to Patreon. Ammo donations are especially useful. Gas as well too, with the prices today. But either way, as soon as the weather cooperates, we'll get out and do some more 2025 testing. But in the interim, how guns like this came to be. And with that, we need to go back to the 1960s, even before the Vietnam War. As I'm sure you know, but some may not, the M1911A1, adopted in the 1920s, was still very much the standard for Vietnam. However, technically, the youngest guns were made in 1945. Now, many had been rebuilt by the government. This is an Ithaca from the war, good honest wear. Of course, it's in 45 ACP. The U.S. kind of had what they had. And for a peacetime military, they had enough. But other guns started creeping in. For example, in 1962, Smith & Wesson started selling these to the U.S. Air Force. In fact, they would officially adopt the Smith Model 15, either -2 or -3 as it happens, as the M15. And this introduced a whole new caliber. Well, sort of. The truth is, 38 special type guns had been in service forever. The Colt Commandos were around, the Smith & Wesson M&Ps, the Smith & Wesson Victories, later Model 10s. The Air Force used those, but then the Army had some too for like helicopter drivers. But this introduced a logistical issue for the ammo. But the Air Force needed guns for, guards, air crews, the like. The Army, on the other hand, didn't always issue a lot of handguns. Vehicle drivers and their pilots would, but, the ground pounders didn't. On the other hand, the Air Force needed more. So they started buying these in, relatively large batches in 62 and going on from there. But they also had to procure their own 38 special ammunition loading. In addition, things like the FN High Power started creeping into service, especially as Vietnam would go on. You'd have other revolvers. The Model 66 from Smith comes to mind, even later the 686. Nearly a dozen guns were being used in large numbers by the 1970s. And when the Air Force took a look, they realized that if they counted, variants that needed different parts, they had over 24 different handguns in inventory. Yeah, and none of them are getting any younger. All the 1911s are at least 30 years old at this point, and 45 is becoming less and less of a standard cartridge. Numbers are decreasing post-Vietnam War. Even the Smith & Wesson revolvers, well, they're wearing out. You know, you get cylinder things. Revolvers are both simple and complicated at the same time. Either way, this gets us to a whole new program to try to coordinate and just make things more efficient with the budget cuts following the Vietnam War. The Joint Small Arms Program, headed by the Joint Small Arms Committee, JASC, was established by 1977 to pick a new service sidearm to replace all these guns and kind of standardize on a new cartridge, and this would be used throughout all 5 branches. But early days, the requirements are vague, and there's a team set up, the Joint Small Arms Synchronization Team, that directly oversees things, testing and whatnot, and this leads to the Air Force kind of being picked to hold the first rounds of trials at Eglin Air Force Base in 1979, and there would be 8 different models submitted. First, though, what were the requirements? And this is a little where it gets vague. Now, the Air Force was going to do hot weather, cold weather testing. They were going to do what they called human factors, essentially ergonomics and shooting. They were going to do sand, dust, mud, probably ice as well. But they didn't really know. Even the cartridge, they were going with 9mm. This is pretty much mandated not just by the JASP or the Air Force, but also the U.S. government, because there was push to standardize with NATO. But at this time, 1977 to 79, there was not a 9mm NATO cartridge yet. This would actually lead to the 9x19 loadings tested here being slightly different than what most European militaries and police were using at the time. This is important. They knew they wanted to have a higher capacity. 10 rounds was preferred, but it doesn't seem like it was strictly required, but that gives you an idea. There wasn't much to do with like size or weight that I can determine. However, accuracy and failure, mean rounds between failure, were much more important. They would measure them. Of course, multiple pistols would have to be submitted. It seems at least 3, but probably more per gun. And you needed a drop-free mag. You needed at least left-hand ergonomics. You needed a good safety. That gives you an idea of what was happening. And we had 8 submittals, as I would say. And to begin with, we should mention that they would have existing 1911A1s just out of stockpiles, including the mags and ammo. Keep in mind that these are M45. There is kind of a control. And since the Air Force was doing it, they also used their Smith & Wesson Model 15s in 38 Special as control. So those were the existing guns. What about for the 9mm? Well, let's begin with FN Herstal out of Belgium. Now, this is actually an Argentine, but it'll work for this purpose. FN actually sent 2 different versions over for the 1979 JSSAP or JSSAST trials. This is, again, before the XM9 name was dreamed up. And one would basically be just the current P35 high power. We're, on the Mark II by now? I don't know if we're quite on the Mark III yet. And it would basically be single action only. Interestingly, it doesn't seem like double action was a strict requirement at this point, although it was preferred. And it would have had an ambi safety and a few other things. This would, of course, have a 13-shot mag, but you're pretty much your standard. And they had an alternative updated version called the Fast Action that they would submit for these trials, which was essentially a double action, kind of analogous to an early BDA. Another entry that might surprise, and you don't hear as much about them today, but when I was a kid, you saw a lot of them, was from Star in Spain. Now, this is not the exact model. They actually submitted their Model 28, but it gives you an idea. And Spanish Stars have been serving military and police for decades. And they were loosely based on the 1911, so kind of familiar ergos. This one is single action. They did have double action versions as well. Magazine capacity was okay for its time. Another submittal would come from West Germany, Heckler & Koch. By the late 70s, they're finally really making a name for themselves. And they would submit two different models. The P9, which we've actually never shown on this channel, never really owned one. And the VP70, which we have shown on this channel and even took to the range a couple of years ago. Interestingly, the P9 only held 9 rounds. So it was allowed to at least go in even if it didn't meet the 10 round. Flip that, the VP70 held 18 rounds. So yeah, kind of the extremes there. From the US of A, we had a couple of submissions. Colt would submit the SSP stainless steel pistol, which is basically an updated 1911A1 for 9mm. Yes, I know there are a few other changes, but very familiar, very base design, frankly. And they never went into production outside of like the 30 that were sent to trial and a couple of dozen more that were just kept around. Smith & Wesson would submit a version of their Model 59, the 459A as it happens. And, you know, we don't think about Smith handguns today, and I don't have one to show you. I don't know if we've even ever shot one on the channel, but they were actually surprisingly decent, and they offered a lot of versions. So, of course, there is one more, the one most famous, Beretta of Italy. In the 1970s, they did a major update of their M951 pistol, turning it into the 92. And then to meet the exact requirements of Italian police, they would have the 92S. And the main difference was they moved the safety from the frame to the slide and introduced a decocker mechanism. But the mag catch is down here. For the 1979 Air Force trials, they would introduce the 92S-1, specifically designed in 1978 for these trials. It would turn this safety ambidextrous. It would have a very good firing pin block, which, you know, with this you kind of need. And most importantly, it would go from the traditional Italian-style catch to the Browning style that Americans know and love. Some sources say it was reversible. I'm not sure, but yeah, the Browning style. So pretty close to this gun, just with slightly different controls. Shape of the frame was the same, blued finish. Of course, 9mm. And 15-shot double stack mag, which more than met the requirements. So quite a few submittals from Europe, and trials would begin and run through 1980. And the results were illuminating. Today we think of H&K as very reliable, dependable, durable. But surprisingly, the VP70 had the highest failure rate, and the P9 wasn't too far behind it. And the Star, while it did better than those two, had a pretty high failure rate as well. That's because European guns, especially the VP70, because it's a blowback, were really meant for a hotter cartridge. And so they just weren't quite getting enough oomph with the American loading. Now, let's be honest, I don't think the VP70, its controls, it wasn't ever going to make it. Star, you know, bless them for submitting. They weren't really going to be there. Really, the only one of those was the P9, and even it was barely allowed in because it had really a lower capacity. So I don't think any of those were really serious. The high power, good old venerable gun. Again, the U.S. had been issuing, or at least some have been carried unofficially in Vietnam, I should say. But it is single action only. 13 rounds is good, more than they required, or at least hoped for 10. But it didn't really have a lot of the more modern safety features that they'd hoped for. Now, the fast action one did better, but it doesn't seem like the FN designs, where they weren't completely dogged on, just really showed themselves to be exquisite. The Colt didn't do very well at all. In fact, Colt, I think, withdrew their submission. It just doesn't seem like Colt's heart was really in it. Interestingly, though, the Smith & Wesson performed pretty good. In fact, I think the only gun that had a better rate of reliability was the Beretta here. They were almost neck and neck. Now, the Smith had a few other detractions. The 459s are okay, but no. In 1980, it was concluded the 92 S-1, soon to be renamed the 92 SB because of these trials, was the clear winner. It had better ergos, it had a high cap mag, it had the safety features they were looking for, it was double single action, good quality maker that could produce enough and, could set up here, because, that's going to be one of the requirements, is they had to be made in America ultimately. But there was another interesting result, not just that the 92 S1 was the best of the 8 guns. They also had some trials for, practical accuracy. And the worst performing cartridge was 45 ACP. And the 38 Special out of the M15 did significantly better with shooters. So kind of validates the Air Force in going with these nearly 20 years earlier. But above those, 9x19, soon to be type classified as 9mm NATO, was the most accurate cartridge, practically speaking, out of the 3. So it kind of pushes the idea of going the 9mm forward. Again, there had been a lot of encouragement from the government and with our European allies, and already by 1980-81, there is that standard forming. So the Air Force said, this is the winner, everything's great, right? Well, yeah, not so fast. The Army protested the results rather vehemently, and you know what? In some ways, they were right. In the Air Force trials, the 1911 A1 had quite a high failure rate. And it was a little unfair to the pistol. They were using, used guns in inventory, more importantly with just, used mags. Mags wear out. And the Army correctly pointed this out. I mean, if you're going to have all new guns, all new mags, you need to have all new 1911s. Now, to be fair, the Colt SSP was a thing, so it was there kind of as a representative. But the M1911, it does feel like it was a slightly handicapped going in. Fair. Now, some other complaints the Army had were about the methodology the Air Force used in their environmental testing and accuracy standards and just kind of scientific method. That's more subjective, and that's not really what my specialty is. For more technical testing, that's more of a Chris Bartocci type deal, who, if his laboratory stuff. I'm not that. I'm a historian, so I can just speak to that. But I will say that the Army at least raised some valid complaints. But I also will say that while the Air Force was thrilled to go to 9mm, get away from having all these revolvers that are wearing out in stock, the Army, they're perfectly happy at this time with their 1911s. And, of course, Colt's happy to have them happy with that, too. Nevertheless, the concerns were valid enough that the JSSAP folks agreed to hold another round of trials. And this time, the Army would be the primary overseer. And there would be all new and stricter criteria for what could and could not be involved. At this time, the XM9 designation starts being used, XM9 trials, with the understanding the X would be dropped upon adoption. So an 81 new criteria laid out, much stricter. They're proven that they're hard asses at the Army. And there are 85 points required. Well, sort of. They say, okay, at least 70, 72 we have to have. The other dozen or so are optional. One important one is it does need to be chambered for the new standardized 9mm NATO cartridge. Another one, it needs to be double single action. It needs to have an ambi safety with essentially what we would think of as a decocker and a firing pin block for safety. It needs a drop-free detachable mag that holds at least 10 rounds. We're making this a solid requirement now, at least 10 rounds. And there's, of course, reliability, accuracy standards there, that kind of stuff. So what happened? Well, February of 1982, the Army makes it real simple. Nothing. None of the guns on offer meet requirements. Let's just stick with the good old 1911A1 America. Hell yeah. And Colt, piping up, kind of that kid at the back of the class, the brown noser, goes, hey, we can just take your existing 1911A1s and rework them to fire 9mm. How about them apples? No one asked for that, but you can kind of see what's going on here. That would have been handy dandy for Colt and the Army. The Marines probably would have been on board too. The idea, though, is if you do that, you still have a single action only gun. And yeah, 9mm, you get a couple extra rounds, 8, maybe 10 at most, versus 7. But this is an antiquated design, guys. Parts have to be hand-fitted. They're not as cheap as they once were. They're not especially light. They're not especially short. And if you're a good 1911 shooter, awesome. They're a very, very accurate gun if you're a good 1911 shooter. However, take a raw recruit, 18 or 22 if it's an officer, and put one in their hands. It's not the most instinctual gun to train on. Yeah, there's no one's happy with this except for the Army and Colt. In fact, the other companies argue, protest, threaten to sue, but more importantly, Congress threatens to launch an investigation, corruption, bribery, whatever you want to say. Shenanigans are called. Therefore, the Army's kind of strong-armed into announcing November of 1983 a third round of trials, still under the XM9 name, and the requirements are further refined, including updating the magazine capacity from 10 to 13 rounds at this point. And we will have 8 submittals again, but not all from the same makers, some new, and we would have some returning guests. Because of the double action on the first pull requirement, the original high power is out, but FN submits the BDA, the modernized high power essentially, and HK takes their P7 and updates it to take enough cartridges, becoming the P7 M13. Yep, it was made for these trials. Pretty cool. And Beretta, well, they stick with it too. They submit the 92 SBF. Again, the S1 became the SB after the Air Force trials, and it was a good gun. Again, ambi, all that. But it had a blued finish, and while it was mostly parts interchangeable, there were a little bit of hand fitting involved, especially things like the locking block. So, the new 92 SBF went to what they call the Berniten finish versus bluing, went to a chrome line bore, and they went to full 100%, no questions asked, parts interoperability. They also reshaped the trigger guard a bit and the grip a bit down here, patterning it too, just for a little better control and accuracy. course, this is my M9. What are you going to do about that? So that's their submittal. Smith & Wesson's still in. They submit the Model 459M, an updated version of the 59A from the original trials, which itself was based on the original Model 59. Remember, it did pretty well in the Air Force trials. And Colt's still hanging in there with their SSP, or at least an updated. Oh, those were kind of the returning guys, at least updated versions. But we do have a few new folks, and one that was always interesting to me was from one of my favorite companies, Walther, or Walter, if you like, the P88. Yeah, this gun was made for the XM9 trials. Starting in 81, they started working on it, and by 84, the trials began in January, and then actual range testing began in February of that year. This was kind of a departure for Walther. They've been using the P38, P1 style. This is using more of a Browning style. Anyway, high capacity, 1 to 9. It meets all the requirements, and you can see that. It's interesting. And then, of course, the one everyone else is familiar with, Sig Sauer. A new partnership had been formed in the 70s to manufacture guns with updated technology. They were some of the first to use like CNC, computer controlling, stamping, welding, and there was a partnership between Sig Switzerland and Sauer in West Germany. And they originally developed this, the P220, for the Swiss military and police. And they started being imported into America as the Sig Arms, mostly in 45, but some 9 in the 80s. And there would be several versions. For example, the P225 was a more compact version in 9mm for West German police, adopted as the P7. But this version here isn't really up to the trial standards. Yes, it is double single action, decocker safety, which technically did meet the requirements of the trials. They also did require last round hold open with the stop release. But this has a heel mounted mag catch, which really didn't meet them, and it only holds 9 rounds. So, again, specifically for the XM9 trials, Sig made the now very famous P226. Essentially, a double-stack version of this with the American-type mag cap. One wholly new entry was from Austria, the Steyr GB. Last year we did a video on it. That's the one that lost out to the Glock 17. Really cool pistol, but in some ways a little dated, a little large, but it had that capacity and it did meet the XM9 standards. So having lost out in their own country, Steyr threw their hat in the ring in America. So we had 8 submittals. What happened? The spring of 1984 was devoted to essentially reliability, dependability testing, all that stuff. And the first one to be knocked out would come at the beginning of May, and that was, unfortunately, the Steyr GB. It just didn't meet the reliability, the dependability standards, maybe even the safety standards required. It just seems like Steyr couldn't catch a break with that gun. And then at the end of the month, FN voluntarily removed their BDA. Again, it was an older design, updated, but it just wasn't making the cut. So I guess before they could be completely humiliated, there you go. I should also mention that one of the stricter requirements of this third round of trials was that the participants would have to submit 30 pistols plus spares of mags and other things. Just throw that in there. So we're down to 6, but not for long. In mid-July, Colt would voluntarily step out with their SSP. Again, I just don't feel like their heart was in it. So as summer rolled around, then there were 5. Already not doing well. The mud test was hard on the Walther P88. Even though it was still officially in through August, its days were numbered and they knew it. This is a really good gun, but it just never felt like it left the prototype design. If it had been, it's kind of the opposite problem of the BDA. It needed to be a little bit older. We'll see soon kind of that sweet spot of old enough design to be mature, but still young enough to be competitive. Yeah, it failed the mud test. On the other hand, the Heckler & Koch P7 M13, the S&W Model 459M, and the Beretta 92 SBF would all pretty much go through the mud tests with flying colors. Interestingly, while it didn't straight up fail, the Sig Sauer P226 received like a C grade, a passing score, but it was the lesser of the 4 remaining guns. So in September of 1984, it was time to chop some entries out. And yeah, Walther would go away. The P88, thanks for playing, but no thank you. The Heckler & Koch was actually knocked out due to reliability. While it was passing things, it had more stoppages than the others. Keep in mind, it's that gas system. It's got that interesting safety. Yeah. It also didn't do as well in the corrosion tests. Okay. That probably could have been resolved. On the other hand, the Smith & Wesson didn't do as well on the long-term durability test. I think there were issues with the firing pin, either losing oomph or breaking. So what I'm getting at is, in September, the Walther was out, the Heckler & Koch was out, and the Smith & Wesson was out. So that gets us down to our remaining 2 finalists. And that really brings us to the most well-known part of the story. In late 1984, the Army Board said that technically both the P226 and the 92 FSB met all requirements. They both passed. I would argue that the 92 maybe just showed just a little bit better, again, the mud and all that, but then there are some things to be said for the 226. They're both technically there. So, since they passed, we move on to more the bureaucratic side of things, the pencil pusher side. Part of these trials, it was going to be a fixed price. It was going to be for at least 220,000 pistols. Again, they need to be made in America. So that's why everyone's kind of going for it. And they would need to commit to a price with spare mags and all that. It's famously known. While, the SIG was pretty much there with the Beretta. Once you kind of factored in all the extras, the Beretta was just a little bit cheaper per quantity. So, January 14, 1985, the 92 SBF is declared the winner. You are a winner. With that meme from, what was it, Over the Road Truckers game? Yeah, I'm blind, but I know about video games. And in Beretta's catalog, it was renamed to the 92F. By the way, the F stood for Federale, or federal, or government trials. And how much did these cost? Well, $178.50 in 1985 money, so 40 years ago. And if you're curious what that is today, I was. It's $526.99. Not bad, but not all that off from what a civilian gun costs you. Of course, this is an M9 commemorative, so it might be a little more. But yeah, you'd think for buying basically 250,000 pistols plus spares, yeah. But they didn't. So it's all over, right? Of course not. Some of the other entries complained, thought they were treated unfairly. Some in the military, not just the Army, but the Marines too, complained. There was a lot of people that didn't want to go away from 45. Even some in Congress still complained, because there's always going to be some. You make half of Congress happy, you make the other half sad. So there he goes. But this is kind of a lockdown commitment, because the Army had made this so strict and all the requirements and everything was locked down. Beretta's got the contract. They met the requirements. They met the numbers. It's locked in. So while protests would go forward, they're doing this. This is officially the M9, and Beretta is switching production from Italy, where the trials guns are made, to opening up, Beretta USA here, produce guns. And that's kind of our story. Well, sort of. Because again, this video isn't just about the XM9 trials. It's about the XM10. Sometimes a long video is a detriment. But in the case of the XM9 trials, it actually is a feature. Because it was such a long, exhausting program just to pick a new damn sidearm. Wars are not won by rifles. They help, but sidearms, I'm not saying they're not important, but it's ancillary. That said, I have to give credit to the U.S. for not just saying, any old gun will do. It took issuing a sidearm seriously, because it's one of those things that you don't need it until you really need it. Someone I knew who served in Iraq in the early war on terror actually used his M9 to potentially save him and his tank crew's lives. So at least the soldier would end up with a combat-proven gun. It's not over yet, though. So yeah, there's already protests in 85. And then issues start occurring. Quite famously, a couple of these released their slides in the field after a few thousand rounds fired. And then in laboratory testing, around another dozen had failures. Most of them over 10,000 rounds, some even over 30,000, so they're holding in there pretty good. But throwing a slide back at you is not fun for the 3 or 4 guys who were hurt. Now, no one was killed, nothing like that. And they were Marines, so it probably knocked some sense into them. But it gave more ammunition to complaints, really to the crowd. And this is becoming more and more of a Marine Corps thing. It just wants to keep using the 1911. In fact, that kind of resulted in the M45 that the Marine Expeditionary Force went to. It's not practical. Therefore, Congress orders another round of trials, known as the XM10 trials, to be held in spring of 1988. But by this point, most of the manufacturers are just over it. In fact, they officially boycott these trials, and kind of leading the charge is SIG Arms in America at the time. They say, look, our P226 passed the XM9 trials. We and Beretta were the only ones to do it. Why should we have to resubmit? I get their point. And they're having success elsewhere. I mean, they're supplying lots of guns to West German police. They're supplying to the Swiss military. They know they make a good gun. The Navy knows it too. And again, I'm not trying to kind of short shaft this gun in this video, because in the next one it's going to be getting featured a lot more. So they're not in the XM10 trials. Now, bless them, Smith & Wesson, well, they submit the 459M again. They've been in from the beginning, since the original Air Force trials a decade earlier. And we have one newcomer. Ruger submits their P85, a gun that I've actually never owned. But very quickly, the Ruger doesn't pass standards. And again, the Smith & Wesson, while a good gun, doesn't quite live up when it comes to reliability, long-term dependability. On the other hand, one benefit of the XM10 trials, it did allow Beretta to update the M9 design. Typically, once you get a government contract, you're locked in. That's how you're making them. But because of the new trials, they were able to introduce an updated variant, the 92FS, which was a safer version. It's the kind that has the preventative measure to keep you from having a slide flung in your face, and a few other tiny product improvements. So technically, the gun that Beretta submitted was different for the XM10 trials, but not by much, and it would actually become the new M9 standard. And finally, after this point in 1988, after it had won, 3 times, it's put to rest. And by 1990, these are being ordered in large numbers. In fact, after winning the XM10 trials, one of the plums that Beretta got was the order was increased by 140,000 pieces. So now the order is bumping about 400,000, and of course it'll go on from there. You know all the specs on the gun: 15 round capacity, 5-inch barrel, 8.5 inches overall, weighs just a little over 2 pounds unloaded. It's not a small gun, as we know, but I love it. The locking system is unique. The barrel doesn't tip out of its plane or profile, so accuracy is maintained. There is criticism for the safety, but part of that is the government itself requiring it. It's got to go somewhere, and they want it in ambi. And that's pretty much how it became a standard for nearly 40 years. So these were still being phased in throughout all 5 branches when the Gulf War would happen in 1991, and the Marines would stubbornly hang on to their 45s at least as much as they could. The Air Force was all on board, and the Army is getting warmer to it, and the Navy was always kind of in the middle, but more or less okay with it. So increasingly it's just the Marines. The Coast Guard, while they have some M9s, quite a few, they also had a little bit different of a role. They're more of a border protection, law enforcement, relevant for video too. So these are everywhere. This is the original M992 FS, and this is mostly the version that would be ordered over the decades. They would introduce a few minor changes, like a polymer trigger, polymer coated this, just, experience in production. And then in 2006, Beretta would introduce this version, the 92 FSA1, type classified as the M9A1, which would be purchased by the Marines in pretty small numbers, and maybe a few other branches besides. It was the first to introduce a pick rail under here. It has the updated polymer-coated controls, which a lot of Americans kind of view as a cheap out, but the truth is, in actual combat situations, they make sense. They also updated the checkering for the grips, and they went to a new coating and style of magazine, that PVD style for sand resistance. Again, a version made for the war on terror, as it were, and experiences learned over the years, but relatively few changes. Now, there were also still issues about the magazines failing, the Checkmate mags and all that, the Airtronics. I will say, when they were using Beretta factory mags, or Metgar, they worked fine. It was the cheapest possible mags that, surprise, surprise, were giving issues. Also, just guns wearing out. One of the failure points is a known point. It's the locking block on the gun. But that's something that a unit armorer can replace, and do it every 5,000 or so rounds, maybe even 10,000, you're fine. And I'm going to be honest, every gun's got a failure point. This one has one too. If you know, you know. If not, we'll talk about it in video 2. And guess what? It's also about a 5,000 round replacement. There's always going to be something when there's heavy use. Nothing's perfect. And that's why, 2009, there was another large order of nearly 500,000 pistol M9, M9A1s, and they would still place smaller orders throughout the 2010s. But of course, in 2017, SIG would get its revenge with the XM17, the M17. Now, Beretta would fight back with the 90 M2A3 or M9A3. The A2 was actually an updated conversion kit. And then that would lead to the A4 we started the video off with here, which is really a great version of the M9. It has a lot of the improvements people wanted, including stuff that Wilson charged oodles of money for, while not sacrificing. Still has a metal frame. It's a slimmer grip. We have a somewhat higher magazine capacity of 18 rounds, modern mag versus the original 15. You can mount a red dot on top, night sights. It has a decocker only safety to kind of address the issues some point out. This was actually started off on the 92G, made for the French. I actually really like this style of safety. And of course, a threaded barrel for use with suppressors, something becoming more and more common in the modern battlefield, and it's in the very common FDE finish. This is the most modern version, although I don't think any military has ever really went with it, at least not en masse. But I'm happy that they're still continuing to update a design that I really do enjoy. And SIG also did that. But it's kind of for the next video, I'd say. But yeah, and a long, exhausting program to pick America's next gun because, damn it, Americans just, they really, 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 really love their 45s, 1911s. But eventually, time moves on. And let's be honest, this is a better gun for the modern day. It's accurate, long enough barrel, good sight radius. You can equip it, even the original with night sights or not. Double single action gives you benefits. Also much safer carry, thanks to the firing pin block and other things compared with the original 1911A1. You have more than double the capacity. Yeah, it's 9mm versus 45, and you're using NATO ball, but on the other hand, 2 follow-up shots faster than 145. Whatever. And it is 100% parts interchangeability. The 1911 still needs some hand fitting. It's a modern gun. At least it was up until 8 years ago when the M17 replaced it. But story for another day. So, yeah, not a video I had planned on doing, but the XM9 and XM10 trials are really interesting and a fundamental part of history and kind of understanding government bureaucracy, both the pros and the cons. And again, the good news is we did get a very good sidearm for our soldiers. It was cost effective and saved lives, and can't say better than that. But of course, this was only half of the program. This was the full-size service gun. A compact gun for, say, military police, criminal investigators, aviators, females, smaller males like myself even, getting in the military was needed. And at first I thought they could just adopt one gun, maybe with 2 different slides, one size fits all. But soon they realized, no, we're going to need something else. And that's why next time we're going to talk about the XM11 trials and kind of how SIG got something back in the end. But for now, appreciate you hanging out with me. Gun I really do enjoy. But what do you think? Do you own an M9, M9A1, A3, A4? Let me know. I think now that they're kind of going out of service, the Berettas are finally getting their just desserts in the public's eye. Because years ago, they got a lot of criticism. But yeah, next time we'll stop on in. If you could, like, share, subscribe, go on Patreon, help us out there if you can. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.